Welcome to this explainer. Listen, I want you to picture this. Imagine waking up in the second greatest city of the mighty Byzantine Empire. We're talking about a place of immense wealth, towering, beautiful architecture, and centuries of unbroken peace. You step outside, right? It's a warm July morning. You look out over the usually calm harbor, only to see a terrifying, highly organized fleet of 54 hostile warships just floating toward your home. And they aren't just gliding. With the wind at their backs, they look like they're literally flying over the water. Well, that was the absolute nightmare that the citizens of Thessalonica woke up to in the summer of 904 AD.
And it brings up a fascinating and honestly truly tragic question. What if the Byzantine Empire's second greatest city fell entirely because its leaders just couldn't set aside their egos long enough to agree on a defense plan? I mean, what if they couldn't decide whether to build a seawall or an underwater fence? It sounds crazy, right? But that is the exact controversial yet completely true reality that doomed Thessalonica. It was a catastrophic event that didn't just destroy a thriving city, it completely shattered the balance of power in the Mediterranean for generations.
So here's the basic premise of what was going on. By the early 10th century, these autonomous Muslim dynasties were breaking away from the Abbasid Caliphate, and they were aggressively dominating the Mediterranean Sea. They had built up these incredibly formidable naval bases and were constantly on the hunt for high-value targets. Originally, they actually had their sights set on the ultimate prize, the imperial capital of Constantinople itself. But after scouting it and realizing the defenses there were simply too massive to breach, they pivoted. They turned their attention to the empire's glittering, wealthy, and frankly, vastly underdefended second city, Thessalonica.
Now, to really understand how this battle went down, we have to look at the people in charge. Leading this massive Abbasid fleet was a guy named Leo of Tripoli, and Leo was brilliant. He was a ruthless renegade admiral. Originally, he was actually born Greek, captured in a raid, and then he converted to Islam and rose all the way up to the highest ranks of his captor's navy. Because of his background, he knew exactly how the Byzantines thought. On the flip side, you have the local Byzantine leadership, and they were a mess, completely fragmented, panicking, suffocated by endless imperial bureaucracy. So you've got this classic mismatch, right? A unified, singular, brilliant vision going up against total administrative chaos.
The tactical mismatch wasn't just in leadership, though. It came down to specialized naval tech. The Byzantines historically relied on a ship called the dromon. Think of it as a sports car, sleek, incredibly fast, powered by 2 tiers of oarsmen, and built almost exclusively for speed and ramming enemy ships in deep water. But the Arabs? They showed up in the shalanda. These were totally different, slightly wider, flat-bottomed vessels with a very shallow draft. And that unique hull construction turned out to be a massive tactical advantage. Why? Because it allowed the invading fleet to sail frighteningly close to Thessalonica's notoriously low seawalls without running aground. Meanwhile, inside the city, the defensive preparations were, well, they were nothing short of a tragic comedy. First, a commander named Patronus comes up with this genuinely brilliant idea. He starts building an invisible underwater fence out of heavy stones from old monuments. The goal was to rip the bottoms out of those flat-bottomed enemy ships as they approached. Incredible idea, right? But then, right in the middle of construction, a new commander named Leo shows up, halts the whole underwater fence project, and orders everyone to build up the city walls instead. Then, you can't make this up, an entirely new commander named Nicetes arrives from the emperor. When Chitsalakes rides out to meet him, his horse violently bucks him off and he's severely injured. So literally days before the largest enemy fleet in a generation arrives, the city's defense is entirely paralyzed by changing orders and freak accidents.
Usually, when you have a massive fortified city, sieges are supposed to take months, sometimes years. Yet this entire collapse took an incredibly brief 3 days. 3 days. It all started on July 29th when the fleet dropped anchor. On the 30th, the defenders actually did okay. They repelled some initial skirmishers who tried to swim right up to the walls with wooden ladders. For a second, the city had this brief, shining moment of hope. But then came July 31st. The invaders unleashed an absolute engineering terror that completely broke the city's spirit, instantly turning the battle into a completely one-sided slaughter. This next part brilliantly illustrates just how tactically audacious Leo of Tripoli was. He realizes pretty quickly that he can't just scale the walls from swaying single boats. So, overnight, he has his men engineer amphibious siege towers. They lashed their ships together in pairs to create these massive, stable, floating catamarans. Then, they took their heavy wooden steering paddles, tied them straight up against the main masts, and hoisted these wooden platforms right to the very top. By doing this, they literally elevated their elite shock troops and archers higher than the city's defenses. Now they could shoot directly down into the terrified Byzantine ranks. It was a game changer.
But the battle wasn't just fought from the sky. It was a total war of fire down on the ground, too. Now, you might be wondering, didn't the Byzantines have their legendary Greek fire? They did. It was a highly guarded liquid incendiary they pumped through bronze siphons. But because of all that chaotic leadership we talked about, the siphons just weren't properly positioned to hit the approaching wooden towers. They totally fumbled it. The Abbasids, on the other hand, were fully prepared to use fire. Once they landed, they aggressively rolled these heavy wooden carts, completely drenched in liquid pitch and sulfur, directly up against the city's eastern gates.
They lit those carts on fire, and the results were absolutely devastating. The extreme chemical heat from the pitch and sulfur was so incredibly intense that it warped and literally melted the iron reinforcement plates right off the city's gates. The wooden structures behind that iron just instantly ignited and collapsed. By completely bypassing the physical integrity of the doors with sheer brute thermal energy, the invaders effortlessly broke right through the secondary landward lines.
While the gates were melting, back at the harbor, those floating siege towers were doing their grim work. Abbasid troops were raining down massive stones, boulders that were way too large to just be thrown by hand. They were also pumping fire through tubes from their wooden crow's nests. The altitude advantage was absolute. The Byzantine defenders down below had no overhead cover, and facing this relentless, terrifying barrage of fire and stone, they completely panicked. They broke ranks. They utterly abandoned the seawalls, leaving the entire perimeter completely defenseless as the Abbasid shock troops just poured over the battlements.
We actually have an eyewitness account of this. A local nobleman named John Cominiates survived the whole ordeal and recorded the sheer horror of this exact moment. He noted how the defenders had all fallen to earth like leaves in the wind, crashing down in terror. It's such a haunting image, isn't it? The protectors of this incredibly great city didn't fall back in some tactical retreat. They scattered like autumn leaves. They completely abandoned the streets, leaving their fellow citizens to face the absolute wrath of the invaders all by themselves.
And what happened next was just a massacre. Once inside those walls, the Abbasid forces showed absolutely no mercy. As panicked civilians desperately tried to flee through the inner gates, the sheer weight of the terrified crowd forced the doors shut. Thousands of men, women, and children became hopelessly trapped in these deadly crushes at the city gates. The invading troops just fell upon these trapped crowds, indiscriminately slaughtering civilians right there in the streets and thoroughfares. That eyewitness I mentioned, John Cominiates, he only survived through immense risk and, honestly, a huge bit of luck. He and his family ran and hid in a tower with rotting floorboards, which just barely slowed down their pursuers. Realizing they were completely cornered, he took a massive gamble. He boldly approached the invaders and struck a desperate bargain. He promised to lead them to his family's hidden treasures if they would just spare his life. He was taken to a local nunnery where he had to watch in horror as other captives were slaughtered right in front of him. He only survived by handing over his life's wealth and becoming a high-value hostage. The immediate human toll of those 3 short days is just staggering to think about. Historical records estimate that 5,000 Byzantines were slaughtered throughout the city during that initial bloodbath. Bodies were left lying in the streets, inside places of worship. The scale of the violence was something this city had not seen in centuries. It completely broke the social and cultural fabric of this Byzantine jewel. But honestly, what came after the slaughter was even more devastating for the survivors. An astonishing 22,000 citizens, we're talking teachers, merchants, children, the very lifeblood of the city, were captured. And remember those Arab shalandas? Because they were built with deep, wide holes for cargo, they were perfectly designed to transport human beings. These 22,000 individuals were chained up, crammed into the stifling, pitch-black darkness of the shipholds, and transported across the sea to be sold in the slave markets of the Mediterranean. The journey for these surviving captives was a literal waking nightmare. Shackled like cargo in the dark, they were deliberately starved. Eventually, they were forced to drink actual sewage water just to stay alive. When the fleet temporarily stopped at the island of Naxos, families that had managed to find each other in the chaos were brutally separated all over again, sorted strictly by physical traits to maximize their value at the slave auctions. And as if that wasn't enough misery, the fleet was battered by severe storms on the way back, splitting ships right in half and sending countless prisoners straight to the bottom of the sea. Beyond the horrific human element of this tragedy, tactically speaking, the Abbasid fleet operated with terrifying logistical efficiency.
They didn't just smash everything and run. No, they spent a full week methodically stripping the city of all its wealth. They successfully freed 4,000 Muslim prisoners who were being held in the city, entirely looted the treasuries, and seized or destroyed 60 Byzantine ships sitting in the harbor. It was an absolute masterclass in turning a swift military victory into a massive, highly profitable logistical operation.
Now, a disaster of this magnitude obviously couldn't go unanswered. This catastrophe exposed glaring, undeniable weaknesses in Byzantine coastal defenses. It forced the deeply humiliated empire to completely overhaul its naval strategies and fortifications in the years that followed. They actually launched a massive revenge raid late in 904 against the Arabs in Tarsus, which did lead to some prisoner exchanges. But the psychological and economic damage to Thessalonica, that was already permanently etched into history. The scar never truly faded.
So what should we take away from this explainer? First and foremost, military complacency is deadly. The Byzantines had the resources, they had the manpower, but their fragmented leadership and total inability to agree on a single, cohesive defense plan directly caused their destruction. Also, naval superiority requires constant adaptation. Just look at those ingenious floating siege towers the Abbasids threw together overnight. And most tragically, when military arrogance and bureaucratic egos clash, it is the everyday civilians who end up bearing the ultimate, unimaginable cost.
It really leaves us with a provocative question to consider. How many powerful empires have been brought to their knees, and how many thousands of innocent lives have been lost simply because leaders refused to cooperate when it mattered most? If Patronus's underwater fence had just been finished instead of argued over, the entire history of the Mediterranean might look completely different today. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning the history that shapes our world, and I'll see you in the next one.